Pak Syafi'i Anwar, but he is still having some problems getting into the Zoom. So while waiting for him, let me open the sessions. But if Pak Syafi'i is already in, I'll give the session to him as the real chair for today's session. And today, from the panel one, we have 4 speakers, and I think all of them are already here. We have Metera, Aldy, Auliya, and Libasut Taqwa, Hasbi, Anwar, and Gustri, Putri, and Alif, Satria. So I think the flow is I'll follow the schedule. So from the first speaker, I'll let Metera, and for as a rule, I'll give every speaker 15 minutes so we can have time for answer and discussion after the presentation. So without further ado, let me invite Mr. Metera to deliver his presentation. Screen is yours, Gede.
Thank you so much, Masiro, for the kind invitation. First thing, before I share my presentation, I'd like to express my gratitude for Compose Research Center at the IIIU, Indonesia's International Islamic University, for supporting my research. And I'm also grateful for being invited to present the first draft of this research, and I'm welcoming comments from the audience later on. So my research is actually on Indonesia's democracies, responding to recent conversations about the declining of its quality. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation shortly. I hope everyone can see my PowerPoint, yeah?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So the title is Democratic Decoupling and Religion Enforcement, Interpreting Contemporary Indonesian Politics. So the reason is actually responding to the current conversation ongoing within Indonesian observers about the declining of Indonesia's democracies, its quality, I mean. And one definitive statement is from Power and Warburton and the contributing scholars in it, basically scrutinizing several aspects of Indonesian democracy, including the restriction on opposition, declining protection on minority rights, and so on. There are 2 points that I'd like to highlight from this current conversations. Yeah, the first is the absence of consensus regarding conceptual tools utilized to capture this phenomenon of the declining quality of Indonesia's democracies. Scholars have been wielding democratic backsliding, democratic regression, decline, deconsolidation, authoritarian turn, and so on, which I understood as reflecting the complexities of the phenomenon at hand. So it's not an easy phenomenon to capture by one simple concept. And as by way of proving the complexity of Indonesia's democracies today is the tendency of those scholars to overlook the resilience of our competitive election. And this is not news, yeah, because as early as 2019, Aspinall and Misner has stated this Indonesia's democratic paradox, resilient elections amid rising illiberalism. This resilient election doesn't really fit with the grand narrative of democratic decline. And I think this is important to be highlighted. And by way of another evidence, recent discourse on rescheduling election, talking about third term, is a form of signals that incumbents are nervous about the processes of circulating elites position, yeah, which means again attesting to how competitive Indonesia elections is. And my initial thought is to diagnose what's the reason behind this tendency of overlooking our competitive election. And a scholar has diagnosed the assumption behind our current conversation, which is looking democracy as a set of unified and interlacing set of institutions. So we tend to look democracy as basically one vehicle that can move forward or moving back in the direction of consolidating or deconsolidating, and they tend to be in one vehicle. So when you see its components actually moving into the different directions, it's not easily comprehended, if you will. This is the limitation of the current assumptions we have. An alternative assumption that also being, let's just say, leveraged by other scholars is to see democracy as a set of institutions that can move into different directions. It has several components, for example, the electoral components that can be moving forward, resilient and competitive still, but at the same time, other components of Indonesia's democracy can actually moving backward. So it doesn't have to be unified and interlacing. This insight came from two comparativists, Ding and Slater, basically advancing the notion of democratic decoupling, in which you see gaps between constitutive elements of democracy. You can see one institution going forward while the other institution going backward. The tension of institutional multiplicity is real, and we have to pay attention to this. They actually also hint at Indonesia undergoing this democratic decoupling, but doesn't really elaborate more. And I would like to pick up from their research by empirically gauging this decoupling. How to empirically gauge this decoupling? Fortunately, we do have democracy data set that disaggregate constitutive institutional components of democracy into its part, and the freedom data set by Theorel, Coppage, and colleagues actually have electoral dimension, liberal dimension, deliberative dimensions, disaggregated into its own index. So in this research, I actually look at Indonesia's democracy's components, its electoral dimension and its liberal dimensions. If my arguments hold, my hypothesis is that our election is competitive and it's meaningfully different than those elections in what we would like to call hybrid regimes, where election exists, but it doesn't really change leadership. And by looking at the scores of Indonesia compared with the aggregated scores of hybrid regimes average, I would like to see, are they different or are they roughly similar? Or in other words, to make it simple, does electoral components of Indonesia's democracy actually outperform hybrid regimes? So to prove that our electoral democracy is doing better, it should outperform the scores, the average scores of hybrid regimes. And the first, this is the description of electoral democracy index from PDM dataset. So its purpose is to capture the extent to which ideal of electoral democracy is achieved, responsive to citizens and go on. And this is the liberal democracy's component, protection of minority rights and so on. And here, the first part of my analysis is looking at Indonesia's score compared to hybrid regimes. Data analysis indeed shows that Indonesia's scores way outperform the average of hybrid regimes by meaningful difference. They're like at least 0.2 course, yeah. If we see the figures here, I demonstrate Indonesia's scores during the new order. After democratic transition, indeed, it has developed better, yeah, but the difference is stark, yeah, from 0.2 and then achieving 0.7 after democratic transition in the late 90s. And hybrid regime scores is indeed way below Indonesia's scores, which indicates that our competitive election, at least from face value, is doing okay. But how about the other dimension that we are talking here in this research project? This is the liberal dimensions of Indonesia's democracies. As current research has demonstrated, our liberal dimension of democracies, which mean the protections of minority rights and so on, is trailing. And if it's so, if we compare Indonesia's liberal scores to Western liberal democracies, where protections of individual rights is indeed a definitive institutional feature, we would see a stark difference, yeah. And indeed, Indonesia's scores, the blue lines, is trailing way behind Western liberal democracies, which means the narrative of democratic regression, democratic backsliding makes sense. But at the same time, we have to be able to talk about the resilience of competitive election as well. And if we look at Indonesia's scores together, the electoral dimension and the liberal democracy dimension, we see a bifurcation. This is essentially what democratic decoupling is. You don't see these two components moving together in the same wavelength, if you will, in the same region of scores. Yeah, if we see Indonesia's components of democracy moving together, unified, we should see the scores as not meaningfully different. Yeah. By which I mean the liberal democracies index should also performing as well as the electoral democracy index of Indonesia's score. This is one of the argument that I'm advancing, basically saying, despite the trailing liberal dimensions of Indonesia's democracies, our electoral democracies score, or the performance of our competitive elections, actually outperform hybrid regime. So in that sense, that feature of Indonesia's democracy is actually very resilient. It's sustained. That's the first argument that I make in this research. Yeah. It also opens up other research agenda. Coming back to the previous slide, we see the cutting point after democratic transition in the late 1990s, the bifurcation. So liberal democracy's dimension of Indonesia democracy is indeed trailing from the get-go. So it's not declining in recent years, but from the get-go, we are not that performing well in terms of protecting minority rights. The question is then, what explains this democratic decoupling? Like, it's almost like the birth defect of Indonesia's democracy. It's not just like we perform well and only in recent decades that we are stagnating and then declining. From the get-go, it seems, at least from the FIDEM data sets, again, we need to take it with a pinch of salt. Yeah, it's an aggregated bird's eye view kind of look into Indonesia's democracy, but still, the question remains. Yeah, the shortcomings is from the get-go. What explains this democratic decoupling? The bifurcation of the liberal dimension and the electoral dimensions of Indonesia's democracies. The second argument that I'd like to make. Oh, thank you, Masiro. I'll make it really short.
Five more minutes today.
Yes, thank you. The second argument that I'm making in this research project is that we need to pay attention to state-religion relations. Scholars in religious politics and democracy, such as Alfred Stepan, has made an argument regarding the limit of religious politics in a democracy. Religious groups can advance agenda in the public sphere, but the state should not enforce them into laws and legislation, because it basically forced citizens into, if you will, forced religiosity in a sense. So the limits of religious politics in a democracy should not be coercion of religiosity and piety. And then my way of empirically gauging the extent to which the state is involved in religious coercion is by utilizing a religion and state data set by Jonathan Fox. We look at religious legislation, but the difference that I'm making with Fox calculation is that I only look at those religious legislation that limit individual behavior or regulates individual behavior, to make sure that it is coercion to individual religiosity and piety. The Religion Enforcement Index, where I calculate those religious legislation, scores countries between 0 and 30. The higher scores, higher involvement in religious coercion. And I'd like to see whether democracies actually enforce religious norms in the public sphere. This is just a sample of religious legislation that I'm particularly looking at. And here's the summary statistics of Religion Enforcement Index. Thank you, Masur. This will be really quick. If you look at the second row, you see democracies. The observation is 90 democracies. I'm looking at the Polity4 index. And the mean is 2.1. The median is 1, which means half of the countries that is democratic only have one religious legislation. Almost none, The maximal score is 16. A democracy that enforces a lot of religious legislation in the public sphere is actually Indonesia. Score 16 is Indonesia. So Indonesia is not typical of a democracy. If you look at the parallel box plot, democracies box plot is actually really thin. Almost 100% of democracy enforce less than 5 religious legislation. Non-democracies, in reverse, actually enforce more religious legislation. And if we map Indonesia globally, Indonesia, the red dots is actually democracies, actually grouping in the upper left, which means the score of enforcement of religion is pretty low, but the score of democratic score is high. Indonesia is drifting to the right, which means not typical of democracies that enforce very few religious legislation. I think we have to pay more attention to this feature of Indonesia as a polity. The state-religion relation of Indonesia, in which the state is enforcing, highly engaged in enforcing religion in public sphere, is actually undemocratic feature. And I would like to assert, maybe in the future research, that this is the source of Indonesia's democratic decoupling from the get-go. Because if you look at other research, the subnational religious regulation starting exactly after democratization from 1999, we have scholars already looking into that. That's my short presentation. I'm welcoming comments and suggestions. And thank you very much for the time. Thank you, Masiro.
Thank you, Mas Gede, and I'm really sorry. I think I didn't introduce you properly, and I didn't introduce this session properly. But now we have Pak Syafi'i Anwar as the chair of this session, so I'll handle over to Pak Syafi'i. I believe he will introduce the session as well as speakers properly. Pak Syafi'i, please, Pak Syafi'i.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Pak Syafi'i.
Okay, thank you, Pak Sirajuddin. And I'm so sorry because of the technical aspect. I mean, the Zoom connection is not so good, and then even I need say assistant from IT, and then now it's okay. But in this regard, because time is running so fast, it seems to me that I'll be able to maintain, or hopefully will be say Thai Malay. In this regard, so I'm sorry because in this regard, I will be a bit strict in using time because we have four speakers, yeah, to give presentation. Now, I would like to continue this session by inviting speaker number 2, yeah, Mr. Aldy, Auliya, and then Mr. Libasut Taqwa. Yeah. Please, just to give you a short information is that both of them, both Aldy and Libasut Taqwa, are students of Islamic Indonesian Islamic International University, and they are interested in studying political Islam as well. And by comparing the development of so-called radicalization of Sharia, comparing between Malaysia and Indonesia. Okay, Aldi and Libasut Taqwa, time is yours.
Yeah, can you hear me clearly, Professor
Yes,
Syafi'i
yes,
Anwar?
yes.
Yes, thank you so much for your introductions. Also for Dr. Siro, this is an honor for us to present our project here. Of course, this is our draft, and it will be beneficial for us to hear your comments and suggestions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Our project is the radicalization of Sharia restrictions in democratic country with Muslim majority, especially a comparative study of Malaysia and Indonesia. Next, please. Our main question is that why do democratic countries with Muslim majority enforce religious restrictions while others not? These questions leads us to the center of a complex understanding in the debate on the compatibility between religion and democratic principles. Recently, several research has offered two broad alternative explanations about the state's regulations, especially on religion. First, the state is possible to implement its obligation to the state's constitution's form. Secondly, the regime acts together.
Hello?
Okay, yes, Professor, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, secondly, the regime acts to garner political legitimacy or gain religious based voter support caused by feasible issues that are able to threaten its power. However, on our opinion, these two alternative explanations cannot fully explain these these comparative questions. Existing theories do not, in our opinions, do not offer viable alternative explanations and persuasive one to address the questions. At least we have two reasons on this. The first is, as a democratic country with Muslim majority, both Indonesia and Malaysia have a distinctive Islam positions as the religious official ally of Malaysia's federal state. That doesn't imply that Malaysia will adhere to the Islamic principles and systems, but rather it will follow the Indonesian and Egyptian model of secularism as political commitment to raid commissions. To make it short, another alternative explanation of doing that, the ruling regime may act to garner political legitimacy or gain electoral support from religious-based voters caused by feasible issues that are able to threaten its power, and is an old and sensible one. Indeed, in existing ideas, cultural and social structural conditions, rather than taking opposing actions that can potentially place its power at risk. Next, please. Yeah, what is the problem? We have considered three main problems on this issue. The first is both countries have secular constitutional mandates. As we know that Malaysia and Indonesia have a kind of similar constitutional that contains secular views of how states address religions, especially in the public space. The second one is the presence of religious or morality police, or we call it as policy Sharia, having an authority to arrest individuals who violate Sharia criminal offense, such as we call it as khalwat in Arabic, or close proximity. The third one is we call this Sharia restriction policy, identifying them as unfavorable policies because they can undermine religious harmony and the respective model of secularism. Next, please. Okay. Again, our main goal is how to compare those two countries. What makes them comparable? We have at least several points. The first is they have the secular constitutional mandate. They also a democratic country with religious political party competitiveness. Both Indonesia and Malaysia have huge competitiveness in terms of Islamic politics, Islamic political parties. Having an experience dealing with popular Islamic movements who want to uphold the implementation of religious restriction or the implementation of Sharia. Government also legalized Islamic law in national legislations to solve Islamic dispute performed by religious court, and also several kind of Islamic law such as financial, economic, financial law, financial Islamic law, etc. Left unknown also is why Malaysia has morality police and Sharia criminal offense, whereas Indonesia does not have that. Our next slides will be presented by Mr. Aldy. The screen is yours.
Just to remind you, you have 5 minutes more. Hello, 5 minutes more. Hello, Aldy. Please make it shorter. Because we have limited time.
I think he is still muted.
Yes, Professor. Ones who oppose it has so and.
Hello.
You are still muted, Aldy.
Oh, Aldy. Hello, Aldy.
Hello.
So I think I will continue this.
Okay.
This part.
Time is running.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I got unstable connection. Can I continue?
Okay.
Yes.
5 minutes more, yeah.
Yes. So how to approach the question? This one, I think the origin of Sharia restriction should be deeply traced to the coalition constraint and political strategy of the regime, personal preference, and social network. I think from this for this, the enforcement of Sharia restriction is actually only one possible reactions. So we argue that the regime is more likely to enforce strict religious rules when confronted with the vulnerability of political survival, which is a combination of two threats. So two threats. intense political rivalry between secular and Islamic party for electoral gain, and the lack of substantial social capital in community to promote religious inclusivity. So next, so we will focus on two variables that should be investigated: how intense political rivalry between parties that makes the power of the ruling regime at risk, and then the social capital condition, because we know that the intense political rivalry between parties, it's not enough to explain the present or absence of political of religious police and Sharia criminal offense. So we need to investigate also about social capital or social structure in both countries that is involved by actors or individual preferences. So we use the method of agreement, and then in this paper we will employ processing for theory building and conduct comparative history to compare certain period in the history of political struggle, and then we will consider about in Malaysia during its critical junctures from the period of 1970 till 1980, and then during Mahathir regime as prime minister, and then during post Mahathir era, and Indonesia starting from the downfall of New Order regime in 1998 Indonesian reform era, and then 2005 about when the submission of the draft bill for renewal criminal court, which contain the point of punishment for adultery and cohabitation, is being submitted on the desk, and then 29 during parliament session and student protest. So we can see this the similarities of control variable that we use, that there are 4 control variables here that we should bear in mind, that there are many similarities between countries, but if there are also explanatory variables that are very crucial to be investigated. It should be noted that we should investigate the intense political rivalry between secular and religious parties in between countries, and weak social capital to promote religious inclusivity, and then strong social capital to promote religious inclusivity in both countries. That it will result in a different outcome. So next, for these variables, so as I mentioned before, that the intense political rivalry between secular and religious parties, it's not enough to explain the presence or absence of religious restriction in both countries. So that's why we need to consider the social capital here. If even though there is intense political rivalry, it can be lessened. It can that can place the ruling regime power at risk. It can be lessened. It can be lessened by strong social capital to promote religious inclusivity. So this key is very crucial for us to be investigated, and because it will influence the outcome variable here. So we are the research findings are the author finding from the Malaysia case show that the electoral competitiveness between secular and Islamic parties and the lack of social capital to promote religious inclusivity pushed the ruling secular regime to set the most accessible alternative policy, imposing Sharia restriction contrary to the secular party expectation. So meanwhile, the author's findings from in the Indonesian case show that the coalition between secular and Islamic parties has reduced the electoral competitiveness that can lead to the political combative and Islamic politicization, and the substantial power of social capital to promote religious inclusivity has provided many options for the ruling secular regime to not impose the policy of Sharia restriction and the midst of Islamic militant group demands in line with the expectation of secular mandate. So thank you. That's all our presentations. Any comments and suggestion will be welcomed, because we believe that we need to improve more our research. Thank you.
Okay, Aldy, thank you very much, and Libasut Taqwa. Now I would like to invite the Dutch people who are two, Hasbi, Aswar, and then Gustri and Putri. They are from International Relations Department, Universitas Islam Indonesia, UII, Yogyakarta. So they will be giving presentation related to state repression on Islamists in Indonesia, a study on the dissolution policy on Hizbut-Tahrir and Islamic divided fronts, API 2017 and 2021. Okay, time is yours, Hasbi and Gustri, any Putri. Please, you have remember that you have 15 minutes. Yeah, please just show the main finding. You have to deal with time actually. Okay, time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Syafi'i Anwar. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear Pak Syafi'i Anwar, as the moderator and dear participants today, let me present our presentation today. And actually, I'm not alone to present my presentation, but I actually am with Bu Gustri and Putri, but she apologized not to present today because of one and another issue that prevent her to present for today. This is actually a simple article on an issue on political Islam in Indonesia, but using a social movement perspective. So relate to the relation between state and social movement or Islamist movement in Indonesia. And we choose the state repression on Islamists in Indonesia and the study on the dissolution policy on Hizbut-Tahrir and the Islamic Defender Front. So we are going to try to understand or to make a description on how Indonesian government responded the existence or the threat of Hizbut-Tahrir, the Islamic Defender Front, since 2017 to 2021. So, all right, let's go to the introduction. It is actually shorter than 50 minutes, Pak Syafi'i.
Okay.
Because I only make some slides on this. The first is that actually from the social movement perspective, the relation between a movement and a state is always in conflict. Even though state actually does not necessarily make a hard approach to this movement. It can be accommodative or it can be repressive approach. It depends on the degree of the threat that is made by the movement. And it also happened to the relation between state and Islamic social movement. As we know that a social movement in nature always seeks to change, to advocate for social change in a state. So, for example, if we take Islamic social movement, as we know that Islamic social movement, some part or some social movement in Islamic group, for example, advocate or fight for changing the current political system to more Islamist one. And it then makes the relation between current state and Islamic social movement in conflict. So this is the first point. The second point is that the beginning of the conflict, actually, the intense conflict between Indonesian government and Hizbut-Tahrir Indonesia and Islamic Defender Front started in 2016 after the anti-Ahok movement, or called as GNPF or GNPF MUI, national defender movement to advocate MUI religious fatwa that decided that Ahok made a religious blasphemy, and it's at the end of the story is that Ahok then put in jail and again was defeated in the gubernatorial election in 2017. And after the story, after the story was on, then the state or Indonesian government, we can see, and so many researchers also analyze that responding the militancy or the increased influence of the Islamist movement after 2016, then state made some hard approaches to the Islamic figures and groups, including also Hizbut-Tahrir Indonesia and Islamic Defender Front or FPI. In these articles or in this research, actually, we try to understand the state respond to the social movement or Islamic social movement by using one concept in social movement called as state repression. So what is state repression? This concept refers to any state action that efforts to contain the influence of a movement. From the state perspective, any movement that tries to change the current condition of the state, it is actually a threat to the state, and it should be contained, it should be prevented, it should be stopped. So this is actually the basic nature, the basic understanding of the relation between state and social movement. And state, as I mentioned earlier, state can choose two kind of response. The first is it can accommodate the social movement, or the second is it can repress the social movement. And in this case, in this case that we study, we see that Indonesian government choose a repressive action, repressive policies to respond to Hizbut-Tahrir in Indonesia. And there are actually some strategies that states respond to these two groups. The first is arresting some figures in this in social movement group, for example. The second is stigmatization, means that the state try to makes a negative narrative to the social movement. The third is persecution, means that a state and its supporters, for example, try to prevent, try to disturb or stop, for example, the agenda or political activities of this movement. The fourth is intimidation. It can be to the individuals who join the social movement by making or by warning the individuals not to join there, for example, and the second is by intimidate the groups by many kind of activities. And the fourth is extraordinary law. It means that a state can make a law or special law to prevent or to stop the movement or the political activities of a social movement. It can be by revoking the legal status, for example, or by making a social movement illegal. So let's see the comparative or the comparison between the state response to Hizbut-Tahrir and Pembela Islam or Islamic Front. The first is if we see from the first point, arrest. Actually, if we see the state respond on Hizbut-Tahrir and it grows, we don't find any arrestment of the Hizbut-Tahrir figures and members. On the other hand, we can see from FPI, for example, or Islamic Defender Front, there was an effort to put in jail some figures, and we can see until today, Habib Rizik Sihab and Munarman have been in jail because of some issues, for example. The second point is that stigmatization. We can see this happen to Hizbut-Tahrir and Islamic Defender Front. The two groups, for example, is included or categorized in Islamist groups that fights for Khilafah state or Islamic state, and it is called as to threaten Indonesian ideology and Indonesian constitution. But especially for Islamic Defender Front, This is also called as violent group because of some violent actions that is done by this group several years ago. And we can also see that there are the issue of terrorism in this organization that made this group also is banned in 2021. And the third variable is persecution. We can see in 2016 and 2017, there were so many actually disturbing of Hizbut-Tahrir figures and Hizbut-Tahrir political activities or agendas in 2016 and 2017, yeah, because of there was a conflict between, for example, Hizbut-Tahrir and other Islamic group, for example, and it made the security apparatus, for example, or the police to stop the agenda of Hizbut-Tahrir. So this is a kind of persecution actually. And on the other hand, we can also see from Islamic Defender Fronts, yeah, actually there were not many kind of persecution that faced by Islamic Defender Fronts before 2021, but there are one actually very controversial issue in last year 2021, where there were 6 members of FPI or Islamic Defender Fronts were killed or shot by the police, and it became a controversy. But from this issue, for example, it can be categorized as a persecution to from the state apparatus or from the state to the social movement. And the fourth point is intimidation. So actually from 2017 until today, there was there was a call, there was a warning from the state to all Indonesian citizens not to involve in these 2 groups, for example, or in radical groups, including Hizbut-Tahrir and Islamic Defender Front. And even, some Indonesian civil servants, and even I think from military services were fired, yeah, or were kicked out from the work because of identified to be involved in these 2 groups or even to support these 2 groups. And the last or the final point is extraordinary law. Making extraordinary law is actually one strategy, one tactic, or one kind of response that can be taken by state. And it can we can see it, yeah, in 2017, where the state issuing extraordinary law called as Perpu Ormas or government in lieu of law 2017, and it became a legal illegal measure to revoke the legal status of Hizbut-Tahrir. And it is continued in 2021, where the state decided also to dissolve and to ban Islamic Defender Front. So looking from these 5 variables of the state repression, we can see or we can understand how is the relations between the Islamic social movement in Indonesia and the state response to the Islamic social movement in Indonesia. So as the conclusion today, I would like to conclude that in responding the high intent of Islamic involvement, state responded by repressing Hizbut-Tahrir Indonesia and Islamic Defender Front through some actions. It can be arrest, stigmatization, persecution, intimidation, and issuing extraordinary law. Thank you, Pak Syafi'i Anwar. And Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Hasbi Aswar, for giving some perspective related to the state repression toward so-called, radical Islam in this regard, and the case study related to FPI and HTI. Okay, because time is running, so I would like to invite the fourth speaker, Mr. Alif Satria from CSIS Indonesia. He will be giving presentation related to Escapades in Papua, understanding the expansion of capacity of Indonesian jihadists. This is the only case study which is post say interesting to be followed as well. Okay, Satria, it's yours.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Pak Syafi'i. So, hi everyone. Whereas every other presenter here have exceptionally presented about how states and also how social movements have tried to enact some form of religious regulations. I'm going to talk about something a little bit more fringe and a little bit more radical. The draft paper that I have with me is titled Escapades in Papua, Understanding Indonesian Jihadist Expansion Capacity. I'm going to divide this presentation into three main segments. I'm going to start with an introduction where I'm going to give this a brief background, and then along with the research methods and hypothesis, and then I will go through the case studies and provide the main findings. And then lastly, I will conclude in providing some policy recommendation and also recommendation to future studies regarding this specific subject. Right, so let's begin with introductions. So understandably, over the last 2 decades, the threat of jihadist terrorist organizations in Indonesia have significantly been reduced, right? We saw the arrests of terrorist suspects between 2018 to 2021 have exponentially increased. For example, records pointed and noted that between 2002 and 2009, Densus 88 arrested over 466 terrorist suspects. Between 2018 and 2021, Densus arrested over 1,200. This means that within a third of the time, Densus arrested 3 times the amount of terrorist suspects in the last 3 years. So that's the first signifier. Second, we also see that the lethality and frequency of terrorist attacks themselves have significantly reduced today compared to like early 2000s. For example, the 2002 Bali bombing resulted in over 500 deaths and injuries. The 2018 Surabaya triple bombing resulted in 60 injuries and deaths. But the 2021 Makassar bombing only resulted in 20 injuries. The 2 deaths were simply the suicide bombers themselves. So that said, there has been a significant reduction in the lethality and also frequency of terrorist attacks. These two, I believe, show significantly how the threat of jihadist terrorist organizations have reduced. However, it is important to note that Indonesian terrorist organizations are notably resilient, right? We saw in 2010 the creation of Lintas Tanzim in Aceh. This is a small group meant to regroup militant members of Jemaah Islamiyah, Darul Islam, and even more militant members of the FPI. After 2016's Operation Magaduraya against the Mujahideen of East Indonesia, the MIT used their social and prison networks to increase their members. By 2020, they were the most active terrorist organizations in Indonesia during the pandemic. JI, of course, after a major arrest in 2007, they prioritized Dawah and they managed to increase members while avoiding arrests. In I think 2019, it was reported that there was around 6,000 JI members. Although how much of them were actual members, how much of them were sympathizers, it's a little blurry to differentiate. Now, one strategy that's commonly used to adapt by terrorist organizations to adapt against arrests is what's termed as branch expansions, right? The branch expansions refers to either the creation of a new branch in a new location or the relocation of an old branch to a new location. This specific strategy was most often used by Al-Qaeda sometime around after 2003 up until I think 2018, where they moved and relocated major bases of operations to places such as Yemen, Mali, and other regions, other Islamic countries, in order to either relocate senior members, develop new safe havens, and simply becoming a symbolic gesture that they are still strong amidst the major arrests and major military operations by US and the West, right? Now, Common examples of branch expansions in Indonesia often involves the Jemaah Ansharut Daulah. The JAD is Indonesia's most notorious and largest pro-ISIS organization. It was developed in 2015, and it has been the most active terrorist organization in the past 5 years. Reports from police and media noted that JAD attempted to develop cells in Papua 3 times in the past 5 years. They tried to develop one in Timika in 2017 up until 2018, one in Jayapura between 2018 and 2019, and then one in Merauke between 2019 and 2021. However, while their attempts to expand are well reported, there's still a lack of analysis on how these expansions were actually done. And I think that this is an important question to ask, because understanding how these expansions are done, what kind of resources they use, how these decisions were strategically deliberated, how groups find safe passageway to mobilize members is very important for policy purposes. It's important because then as policymakers and states and CSOs, we're able to then identify these specific points that enables mobilization and the creation of new branches, and maybe prevent these groups from creating and utilizing those in the future. Understanding that, the research question that I had for this draft article is essentially this: how do Indonesian jihadist terrorist organizations expand their base of operations, right? Now, to answer this question, the study compares 3 case studies of known branch expansions by jihadists in Indonesia. As I've mentioned before, it's a JAD expansion to Timika, the JAD expansion to Jayapura in 2018, and then the 2019 JAD expansion to Merauke. Now, the question is, why were these case studies chosen? These case studies were chosen for 2 reasons. First of all, it's definitely policy relevance. The JAD is the most lethal terrorist organizations in the past 5 years. Out of the 9 major terrorist attacks, 7 of them were conducted by the JAD. But second, the reason is simply data availability. Unfortunately, terrorist organizations are very clandestine organizations, and therefore data regarding how they operate is very limited, right? The 3 case studies that I've mentioned before is the rare 3 where data is in abundance, and that's why they were chosen. Now, how did I come up with the data to analyze these changes? Well, primary data for this article are sourced from publicly available court documents of JAD members who were arrested between 2018 and 2021. Here in CSIS, we've been collecting court documents of terrorist suspects beginning from 2003. We currently have around 1,000 of them in our databases. But for this specific article, we're using 16. These are the individuals that were personally involved in the 3 expansions I mentioned before. Now, having gone through the nitty-gritty of the rationale for research and how I was going to do it, let's proceed to the second and I think most important part, which is the case studies and main findings. Now, let me go through the case studies extremely quickly because I don't want to be bogged down here. So let's talk through them one by one. The JAD expansion to Timika in 2017. This was an expansion conducted by a team of 3 people. And they were headed by a man named Cecep. Cecep was born in Sumatra, but was raised in Timika and then moved over to Bandung and Bekasi, where he then connected with members of pro-ISIS groups and through Telegram channels. So, this team had a member of from JAD from Balikpapan, and all 3 of them were connected via Telegram. It was not until all 3 arrived in Papua that they actually met with each other. Second, on the first expansion, they moved to Papua in January 2018, wanting to establish a training site for other JAD and pro-ISIS members. When they were there, the first thing they did was they meet each other like 3 to 4 times to establish rapport, because as I said before, they never met before they were in Papua. They surveyed locations for training sites. However, this ultimately failed because people did not want to go to Papua simply because they did not trust Cecep and they did not trust the other members of this group. They also tried to make a Quranic learning institution by the name of Yayasan Masyarakat Muslim, but failed to do so because nobody knew how to lead an institution. And lastly, they tried to make bombs using an online guide they found on Telegram. They were arrested in 2018. The JD expansion to Jayapura.
You have 5 minutes more.
All right. Okay. I mean, if I only have 5 more minutes, allow me to probably discard this case studies. We can talk about this a little later, and I'll go through my main findings. So the question earlier that I asked was, how do jihadist terrorist organizations conduct expansions, right? The main finding is that, as opposed to being strategic efforts from jihadist organizations, branch expansions are largely haphazard and decentralized operations decided by individual cells. These branch expansions in Indonesia are commonly marked by 2 characteristics. One, the lack of collective deliberation or coordination between cells, so they don't talk to one another and they don't strategize to move over. And second is the lack of collective resource mobilization from other cells. That means once they went to Papua, no one else in the group ever contributed any form of resource to help them do so. So let's go through this, right? First, lack of collective deliberation. Throughout the case studies, we found that the decisions for members to expand to Papua never involved any deliberation or coordination with other leaders in the group, and were largely motivated by very personal cell-level reasons, and sometimes by mere chance. For example, for the JED expansion to Timika in 2017, members wanted to establish a cell in Papua to act as a training site for other members, right? However, closer inspection of the court documents showed that the reasons are highly personal. Cecep, for example, the leader of the group, wanted to move to Papua to find a better chance for work and to find livelihood. Secondly, he also wanted to move to Papua because he wanted to be recognized by fellow pro-ISIS supporters. So the motivation to go to Papua was not strategic, it was very personal instead. Other team members who was connected to larger JAD groups, such as Bambang, who was a part of the JAD in Balikpapan, did not once deliberate with other members and seniors of his Balikpapan cell. This shows that in Timika in 2017, the decision to go to Papua was very personal and it was very insulated. They did not talk and discuss and strategize with other JAD members outside of that group. This is also the same with the JAD expansions to Jayapura in 2018. Members were motivated not by strategic reason, but by cell reasons. They wanted to simply flee arrests that was being conducted in Lampung in 2018. There were indeed some strategic reasons why they wanted to choose Papua. They believed that Papua was far from Lampung. They believed that Papua had complex security problems where they can hide. But without the initial need to flee, they would not have expanded. Similarly, also, the decision in 2018 was deliberated only to selected members. The leader of the group at the time, Rudi, only deliberated with one other person, which is Solihin, right? Other JAD Lampung sub-branch leaders were not consulted at all. The third example shows similar things. The leader of the group branch expansion then was a man named Andy, and he had ideological reasons why he wanted to go to Papua. He wanted to develop and establish a safe space in a rural area to survive the end of days. He believed that Dajjal during Kiamat will only attack cities and not a rural area such as Papua. However, importantly, he had no exact reasons why this rural area had to be Papua and had to be Merauke. Court documents show that this was actually selected by chance. The woman that he wanted to marry, which is Irma, was actually in Merauke. So if he did not want to marry Irma, he might have established this new branch somewhere else. So from this, we can conclude that there is a lack of collective deliberation and decisions were made by personal and sometimes mere chance reasons. The second example is that there's a lack of collective resource mobilization. In all 3 case studies, cells had to rely on their own resources to expand. The JAD central leadership and other cells never committed or supported the development of a Papua cell. For example, in 2017, members had to use their own money to buy tickets and ingredients for bomb making. When their own financial or human resources were insufficient, they needed to rely on the resources of their social networks, of their families, not other groups and not other cell members.
Alif, sorry, your time is over. Please make it shorter.
All right, okay.
Almost,
so
yes.
having said that, let me go through the last slide. The question is, what's next, right? I'm going to provide 2 future research agendas. One, I think we need to expand the case studies. I think we need to ask questions whether or not branch expansions by religious terrorist organizations and ethno-nationalist terrorist organizations, like the OPM, for example, have similar characteristics. We also need to see whether or not the characteristics of branch expansions in early 2000s are the same as branch expansions that are done today. But then importantly, 2 very quick policy recommendations. One, state and media should not hyperbolize the threat of a terrorist group. Whenever a terrorist organization makes a branch in Papua, most likely they're not supported by larger groups. So they're not really strong, they're actually weak. But second, to prevent branch expansions, counterterrorism agencies should focus on cells' social networks. As I've said before, during branch expansions, cells rarely deliberate in share resources across organizational chain of commands. They more often share resources and deliberate between personal connections. That said, I think these are the 2 policy implications and future research agendas that others are, by all means, please go ahead and either implement or do. But with that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you very much, Alif. It's very interesting to follow, presentation from the 4 speakers, which is, in my perspective, completing one to each other. And of course, there are certain differences one to each other, but this is normal, and then all the presentation need to be taken into account. But the problem lies in the fact that we still have, say, only we stick to time. 8 minutes more. 8 minutes more. So in this regard, I would like to ask the committee to give additional, say, around 5 minutes to say, 10 minutes before 5. Then we can open a discussion in this regard. Hopefully, will be very, very quickly. But in general, because I was also told by the committee in order to make a brief comment, let me give my short comment, very, very short comment related to the 4 presentation, because this is the obligation of, as a chair, and then of course the second level of panelists. The first is that related to the presentation of Metera, is very, very interesting and full with data, etc. But my short comment is that, because he's focusing related to state religion politics, religion policy. So in this regard is that, based on your paper, especially in the end of your paper, it is interesting that majority of the so-called, what you just mentioned, the state religion policies is not really state, policy, but also I would suggest this is what I call societal pressure religious policy. Why societal? Because actually, as a matter of fact, that is not state policy, but something like pressure from the society, especially from the conservative one. According to your data, it's quite clear. No formal regulation, but it is basically on the basis of pressure from the state, especially Muslim conservative. That's the first point. The second point is about Aldy and Libasut Taqwa. I would like a bit make a comment that politically speaking, is that Constitution of Malaysia is not what I call secular constitution, because in Malaysia it's quite clear that Islam is in its constitution. Islam is an official religion of the state. That's the first point. And so you could not say that this is secular constitutional. No, because in its constitution is that Malaysia definitely not a constitutional, a secular constitution. That's the first. In this regard, I would suggest it would be better if you, because you discuss about policy morality, etc. It would be better if you also discuss about hudud, yeah, the implementation of hudud, because this is related to police moral, etc. because it's very, very important. But in your discussion is limited, so I would suggest you can develop further, especially focusing, or not focusing, just make something analysis toward hudud, the success and value of hudud implementation, despite the fact that past proposed this kind of say hudud, but in reality, a majority of Muslims in Malaysia rejected. Okay, the certain comment, and from Hasbi, I would suggest in this regard, it is very, very important. You make what I call as sorry to say this, you may agree or disagree with my opinion, Hasbi, but you need a balanced perspective, and then say more what I call as a cover both sides. In this regard, your state repression idea, of course, yeah, it is acceptable, but it would be better if you also develop something observation that related to the way the API and then HDI develop their agenda, etc. This is very, very important. So you make balanced perspective. So you can develop say more neutrality. You must make a balanced perspective in this regard. This is my point. Last point is that also Alif, yeah, it's very, very interesting for me because it's a case study in jihadists in Papua. But in this regard, is the last part of your presentation, it was quite clear that just discuss boldly, mostly focusing on the value of jihadists in Papua. I would suggest if they are able to develop, branch or whatever activities in Papua, it's been there also quote unquote success. So you have to develop the success of the jihadists in spreading their idea in Papua. This is my very, very big comment. I don't know in this regard with useful or not, but this is my obligation as a chair to give a short say a comment. Now I would like to because the time is limited, so I would suggest that better to just myself, and then very interesting. Any question? Yeah, any question? Question from Papa Hasbi, for Pak Hasbi, yeah, from Pak Zain Jahul Anam. Question: would HDI and VR are stigmatized as a threat for the state ideology? Why is the state more coercive or repressive to API and HDI indicated by non-HDI member in jail? Good organization? I don't know. It's not incomplete. That's the question. So what's it? I would like to read the question. Why is the state more coercive or repressive to API and HDI indicated by non-HDI members in jail? I just read the question. Okay, please, Pak Hasbi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Pak Syafi'i. It is actually a very difficult question to answer, yeah. Why a state makes more repressive policies on API, especially, for example, to arrest API figures than Hizbut-Tahrir. But for me, I think it is actually because of the how to say, the popularity of Habib Rizik Sihab. Habib Rizik Sihab is a very potential Islamic figures, and since 2016 until 2021, I think he has a the popularity of this figure is increasing, I think. And it is not limited to only API, but it is sometimes, or oftentimes it is called as the Imam of Indonesian Muslim. Okay. I think from the political perspective, it is actually very potential to Habib Rizik to be very influential to the future Indonesian politics. And I think for a current regime, I think it is not something that is liked by the current regime, because as you also see, the main figures that that led the 212 movement and I think Habib Rizik is the main figures, and he's actually a very popular. And it can also be repeated again in 2024. So I think from the perspective of the regime, if it is not contained, if Habib Rizik, for example, is not contained, then it can be a problem again to our future political agenda or in Indonesian political agenda. It is different with Hizbut-Tahrir. Hizbut-Tahrir has no main figures that accepted by Indonesian Muslims, I think, especially also its Khilafah agenda. You know, if, the idea of Khilafah in FPI is not actually the main thing. Even, you know, FPI also say that we just want to make Indonesia Sharia and in NKRI scope, for example. So it is very much different with Hizbut-Tahrir. Okay. I think that's the main point why state choose to make more or harder repressive policies on FPI than Hizbut-Tahrir.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to read again a question from Mr. Hikmawan Syafi'i. Yeah, I have two questions. The first question is for Mas Hasbi Anwar, and the second question for Mas Alif. For Mas Syafi'i, what is the political implication of the state suppression against Islamist movement, particularly HTI and FPI? That's the first. And for Mas Alif, interesting research on jihadists and jihad in Papua. Is there any more instrumental methodology to be used to observe the jihadist development there? And what is our theoretical approach to the expansion of jihad in East Indonesia? So two questions addressed to Mas Hasbi and then Mas Alif. So please respond briefly, yeah, because time is running. I'm sorry for this because this is
okay. I first, yeah, Pak Syafi'i. I think it is actually quite related to Mas Alif explanations. So actually, in social movement perspective, there is a theory that said that if a social movement is stopped, then it can create another kind of movement. And it also happened, I think, in JAD, yeah, in Indonesia. It is stopped. It is stopped. It is banned. Then it can create another kind of movement. It happens also in Indonesia today. You can see Hizbut-Tahrir figures played by making many branches, many kind of organization. It can be young organizations, Muslim preachers organization, business organization, and it also happened in FPI. You know, FPI still exists today, but not from Pembela Islam, but from Pejuang Islam, if not mistaken. Front Persatuan Islam. So it can, you know, the name can change, but the structure, the figure is still the same. So it is actually, you know, it is actually the behavior of a social movement. Once the social movement stops, then it can change to another kind of movement. It is a future challenge, I think, for our state. Thank you. Wow.
Okay, thank you. Then Mas Alif, okay, that is yours.
Yeah. Quick answers here. What other methods can be used for my specific research question? Because I'm asking how. I think it has to be other qualitative methods, right? So we're going to have to talk about making interviews with ex-terrorists or conducting FGDs. But those two methods are extremely difficult if you want to apply them in the context of extremist organizations, but definitely certainly can be done. I don't think any quantitative methods can be used to answer the question of how. It can be used maybe to answer the question of why, and like if understanding patterns and correlations for sure, but not for the questions that I asked. Second, my theoretical approach, I think I borrow a lot from organizational dynamics theory. I believe that terrorist organizations, before they are terrorists, they are an organization, and therefore theories such as collective action theory and like path dependence theory like matters a lot, right? Organizations can only do a certain activity if they have the resources to do them. And so that's why a lot of my analysis prioritize on understanding how they gained the resources, what kind of financial resources or social network resources that they have, because without the resources, organizations can strategize however they want, but they won't be able to do them. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all speakers. Yeah, I greatly appreciate which is very interesting presentation, and it seemed to me that one completed each other, and then very interesting from my perspective. Yeah. Of course, in this regard, my suggestion is that if you would like to develop into article, paper, etc., you need to revise again, and then of course, make additional reference as well. And then one important things that people say, you also in general is that if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the three speakers use a qualitative method, yeah, as far as I know, qualitative method. So it would be better if also say to be completed with in-depth interview, yeah, in-depth interview as well. This is my suggestion. Of course, in this regard, it's up to you, but I would suggest it's better for you to develop into a more proper and then of course eligible to be published, because publication is important in this regard. Okay, I have a question. What is your recent recommendation improvement? From Tanti. Okay, last. I'm sorry because still the committee, please, Pak Ridwan, you still have time, additional time, Pak Ridwan?
Yeah, you can continue. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay, if you give me a time for say say additional time. I mean, so let me read again. Question from Tanti Suryani. For the first speaker, I have question. What is your recent recommendation? Excuse me. From Tanti, Okay. For the first speaker, I
there
have
is
question.
previous one. Please read the previous one.
Tati, right? Tati Suryanti, correct?
No, there is a previous one.
Previous one. Oh, Alif Satri. Alif Satri, yeah. Okay. Why you use the concept of jihadist terrorists instead of terrorist concept only? It is redundant. Moreover, what you do is choosing the very meaning of jihad concept based on the Islamic worldview and teaching. In addition, by using jihad or jihadist concept, you are following the discourse of Orientalism. Copy-paste the reality based on the Western worldview, which is too narrow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the
So,
first. Okay.
Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion, which
Yes.
I happily will answer. So I don't think it's redundant. Jihadists and terrorists are two very different things, right? So a terrorist organization based on the literature is divided largely into four waves. You can start with anarchic terrorist organization, and they're ethno-nationalists in the 1960s, and then the new left wings with the PFLP and like the PLA, and then the German Red Army faction, and then more recently, religious terrorist organizations. And religious terrorist organizations don't only include Salafi jihadists, they include Shirinkyo in Japan, for example, or other like Christian groups in Israel at the time, or Jewish organizations in Israel. But specifically as to why I said jihadist terrorist organizations is because the case studies that I do use Salafi jihadists. These are terrorist organizations that have Salafi leanings and wanting to implement Sharia law using violent form of jihad. We can debate even further whether or not jihad is like small jihad or larger jihad, but I think the use of terminologies is simply there to ease the process of discussion. Of the reference commonly used by terrorist scholars is that they are jihadist terrorist organizations. And these are used by the Egyptians, and scholars in Mali, and scholars in the West as well, but also scholars in Malaysia and Singapore. But it's a great discussion to have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is that from Septa Dinata, to the first speaker.
Pak Syafi'i,
Yes?
I think the last timing will be on 5. The schedule for the on the Zoom.
Yes.
And before we end, we hope that we can have a photo group session.
Okay. Can I continue? Quickly,
Yes.
5 minutes more. Please, the speaker, please answer shortly. And shortly because time is limited. we are running on time. I know that. Let me read first to the first speaker. What is the exact definition of religious legislation you apply? Does that include halal legislation or policy, Islamic inheritance law, marriage law, etc.? Okay. Yes. Please answer briefly. Ask today. Yeah. Ali Syafi'i, oh, come on, because Ali Syafi'i, why use concept of jihadist terrorist? Okay, well, already. So please, the first speaker, Mas Pede, answer.
Yes, thank you, Pak Syafi'i, for the time. For Masepta, the data set is available publicly, so I would be happy to share it with you. There are a list of religious legislation there, including the one religious court that has jurisdiction beyond inheritance laws. So that's also counted. For Mbak Tanti, if I'm not mistaken, the privilege of issuing religious legislation is not bestowed upon regional government. So simply central government can rescind the subnational religious bylaws if they have willingness and political will to do so. Thank you so much. I hope my short answer would be sufficient. Thank you, Pak Syafi'i.
Okay.
Time is yours.
Yes, okay. Then the last is that, still, the first, I have question for research recommendation. For the first speaker, what is your research recommendation improving the democratic situation of Indonesia, since the religious organization is the era of regional autonomy? Also create the difficulty to control. I think it's the last question, yeah, because we are running out of time. Is that possible? Please, Pak Bede. Short question here.
Come again, Pak Syafi'i. There is another question for me?
Yes, I think for the first speaker, I have question. What is your research recommendation to improve the democratic situation of Indonesia?
Yes, Pak Syafi'i, I did.
Yes.
I did answer that already. I think the central government should rescind the subnational religious bylaws if they have political will to do so, because the privilege of issuing religious legislation is not bestowed upon regional governments according to the decentralization schemes, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong. Somebody please correct me though. Thank you so much.
From Jahrul, simple question to Mas Alif. Why does Papua become an interesting target for jihadists to expand their movement? Please, running time.
Yeah, really quick answer. So there is no single answer to this. It depends on the cell of the terrorist organizations. In the first JAD cell, they wanted to expand to Timika in 2017. The reason was twofold. One, because they couldn't go to Poso. At the time, there was Operation Magado Raya against the MIT. But second, because they believed that Papua is an easier place to find job and work. So that's their motivation. The team that wanted to go to Jayapura in 2018 wanted to go to Papua because they believe that Papua is where corruptors go to and they don't get arrested there. So they wanted to flee Densus 88 arrest in Lampung to go there as well. The reason why the team in 2019 wanted to go to Merauke in Papua was because simply because the leader of the group, which originated from Probolinggo, was marrying a woman in Merauke. And that's why he moved to Merauke and established the organization there. If he married like a person in Kalimantan, it would have been established in Kalimantan. If they married someone in like Sulawesi, then they would have then established in Sulawesi. So it's a combination. I really can't say like there's a single reason. There's definitely strategic reasons to go there, but if you look in more detail, the reasons are very personal and very unique to each cell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Time is 5 p.m. So it's time to end this very, very interesting discussion. Anyway, so I greatly appreciate to our speaker. Please give applause to them. Okay. Now, times for the committees that they asked me to in order to give opportunity to taking picture for our presenters, and then of course in this regard next time is please Pak Ridwan. Pak Ridwan.
Okay, Pak Syafi'i. So it would be great if everyone could open the camera so we can have the picture. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
1, 2, 3. Okay, that's good. Okay, once again. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well done. Everything is okay. And then very interesting anyway discussion and then a big debate, but it's very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you for Pak Alif, Pak Putri, then Aldy, etc. Yeah, for your contribution, and then of course as the great president. Please, I would like to leave the webinar and then thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum.
Thank you, everyone. Great discussion there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
See
you all.
you on the
Thank you.
session tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Yes.
Good afternoon,
tomorrow.
everyone.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Okay.